some of our political experts into this conversation for some serious analysis. And Malika, Henderson, how do you think Christie's leaving the campaign right now, leaving the effort to win the Republican nomination is going to play out as far as the other candidates are concerned?
Well, listen, I think the immediate eyes are turning to Iowa. Of course, there's this debate tonight between Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. Christie wasn't really playing in Iowa, so probably won't have much impact there. I think the big question is New Hampshire. Does he endorse Nikki Haley before that primary, before people go to the polls? They were kind of drawing from the same pool of voters, the sort of never Trumpers, which are about, 30% or so of the party. So we'll see. Listen, I think the question that Christie finally asked was, did he have a path to the nomination? It's the same question that somebody like Nikki Haley has to ask, right? New Hampshire isn't its own path to the nomination. You have to win a collection of states, and so far, even Donald Trump in a state like South Carolina, which is Nikki Haley's home state, the last poll I saw from last week, Nikki Haley was down 30 points to Donald Trump in her home state. So,
but her numbers in New Hampshire, according to the latest poll, are going dramatically up.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the question for her is how many other states are like New Hampshire, right? In so many ways, even a state like South Carolina is more sort of culturally built for Donald Trump than it is for Nikki Haley right now. So she still has a ways to go, though she is making some progress in New Hampshire, and we'll see what she's able to do on the debate stage tonight against DeSantis.
See what she has to say tonight. We'll watch that closely. What do you think the immediate impact, Gloria, is going to be?
Well, I don't think we're going to see any immediate impact in Iowa because Christie wasn't playing there. You may see some impact in New Hampshire, but what was so stunning to me about Christie's speech, which I thought was really heartfelt and quintessential Christie, because he left no stone unturned, and when he wanted to criticize somebody by name, he did, was the disdain that he showed for his opponents in the race. This wasn't like, you've got a lot of other great people to choose from. I'm sure you'll make the right pick. I mean, what he said was, anyone who is unwilling to say that Donald Trump is unfit to become president is unfit to become president. And we all recall that point in one of the debates where Nikki Haley refused to say he's unfit, and they went back and forth on that. So I was it was Christie saying, look, we're the party has destroyed itself because we can't even come up with any candidates who wouldn't raise their hands and say they wouldn't vote for a convicted felon. And I think he's a man without a country right now, and he knows it. And you could see it in his demeanor. And he was clearly not depressed just because he's getting out of the race, but I think he's really concerned about his party. And he even admitted, look, I made a mistake when I endorsed, Donald Trump early on, and that was because of my own ego. I did that. That's not an easy thing to say to people, but he said it. And, so I think in terms of political speeches, this one's going to go down in the history books.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Alice, what was your reaction? What do you think is going to happen?
Look, I think the fact that he, as Gloria said, went after the other candidates says a lot. I break his speech down into three different buckets. One, fitness, one, the focus, and one, his future. He talked about Donald Trump and his fitness for office, saying he is unfit for office to be the president of the United States and return to the White House. But he also said any of these other candidates that support him and don't push back on him, they are unfit to be president as well. And he talked about the focus of these other campaigns, spending so much time in the smallness of these campaigns, spending time on when is this Republican candidate going to get out? When are you going to drop out? Instead of going after the front runner who he sees as a threat. But then he also talked about his future, what he's going to do. And he has doubled down and recommitted to making sure that he does everything he can to keep Donald Trump from the White House. And look, it sucks to drop out of a campaign. It sucks. And I think everyone saying, who are you going to endorse? Who are you going to support? Needs to sit back, give him time to rest, recuperate, and regroup, and let him decide what he wants to do moving forward. But clearly his supporters more than likely will go to Haley, and that is in her best interest.
And Gloria, I want to just read a statement we just got from Nikki Haley reacting to Chris Christie's decision. Let me put it up on the screen. Chris Christie has been a friend for many years. I commend him on a hard-fought campaign. Voters have a clear choice in this election: the chaos and drama of the past or a new generation of conservative leadership. I will fight to earn every vote so together we can build a strong and proud America. Gloria, what's your reaction?
That is looking for an endorsement, I would say. You know, you're a great guy, Chris Christie, and we've been friends for many years, and so please endorse me. But I didn't see that forthcoming tonight. It could come at some point, I guess. But unless he sees her get tougher on Donald Trump, I don't see where that goes.
Yeah, I think it's tough for him to make the statement he made tonight about how he doesn't feel there's any other candidate in the race who's willing to call out Donald Trump and the fundamental threat that he believes Trump poses, and then turn around in the next 12 hours and endorse one of those candidates.
We'll see if she does tonight, if she really goes out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what he's that's the big test, I think, and he's seeing if Nikki Haley is going to pass it. Alice, you talked about, he has to have this timeline and he's got to rest and recharge. You know, the clock is ticking, right? I mean, if he really wants to have an impact in New Hampshire and Nikki Haley sees New Hampshire as a launching pad to defeat Donald Trump, then, Chris Christie's kind of got to get on it.
Yeah,
He may be on the phone to Liz Cheney right now. I mean, who knows, right? He sounded an awful lot like her when he said he's going to devote the rest of his time to defeating Donald Trump. Who does that sound like?
Yeah. Kate, I want to get your reaction to a key part of Chris Christie's speech that we just heard. Listen to this.
Please understand this. I have known him well for 22 years, more than anybody else in this race has known him. And I can promise you this: if you put him back behind the desk in the Oval Office and a choice comes and a decision is needed to be made as to whether he puts himself first or he puts you first, how much more evidence do you need that he will pick himself?
What do you think?
Well, this is a really effective general election argument against Donald Trump. I mean, you can imagine Chris Christie as a surrogate, in the general election campaign for Joe Biden, making this argument. I mean, we see for the base of the Republican Party who is loyal to Trump, that's not persuasive to them. They believe Donald Trump has their back, that he, his taking on the system is taking it on their behalf. But most voters in the country, outside of the base of the Republican Party, don't feel that way. And it is an excellent way to exploit a lot of the pieces of a Trump presidency that would be chaotic. So hearing Chris Christie kind of lay down that umbrella, it kind of shows you what he's thinking about. We've been talking about, he's thinking about his own future. He's definitely leaving a pathway to be a critical voice against Trump in the general election. It'll be interesting to see if he chooses to do that. But that is, that's an argument that Joe Biden and the Democrats are making about Donald Trump. And it's helpful to hear Chris Christie as somebody who knows Trump, who obviously was incredibly close to Trump in 2016 and can vouch for him as a person, or I shouldn't say vouch, can speak to his character or lack thereof.
It's
helpful to have him do that.
Yeah, it's a great ad for Joe Biden, right? I think the further question, I think, for Chris Christie is how far will he go, right, in a general election if Donald Trump is the nominee? Would he endorse Joe Biden, right? We saw some Republicans do that. Governor Kasich, for instance, in 2020, he was kind of a big part of the nominating convention for Joe Biden. Is that something that Chris Christie would really think about doing?
But I think the argument that we just pointed out, Christie calling out Trump as being a threat to democracy. Many Republicans certainly agree with that. But if you've noticed, Haley and DeSantis have really stopped short of attacking him on that. Instead of that avenue of attack, they're more going after Donald Trump for the chaos and the drama and painting themselves as a new generation of optimistic leaders that will look forward for the American people instead of look past for your past grievances. I think that is a great message to rational Republicans. Unfortunately, it's not really cutting through, and it's really not stopping Donald Trump from having a 20 and 30 point lead in many of these states. I'm anxious to see how they navigate that field in this debate.
Well, as Chris Christie, I think he asked Nikki Haley once, what chaos? Tell me the details. What drama? Tell me the details. Just don't say chaos and drama. That's an easy way to kind of toss it off. And she also, has said in the past that she thought Donald Trump was the right president at the right time. And I think
That was 4 years ago.
Right, and I think after January 6th, that is really when, according to my sources who are close to Christie, that is really a moment for him when he really turned completely on Donald Trump. I mean, I'm not saying he wasn't halfway there already, but, I don't know who he joins with, who his compatriots are. There's got to be a rebuilding of the Republican Party to a degree. And, does that amount to a third-party candidacy, which could give the White House to Donald Trump again? So he's got a lot of decisions
How important,
to make.
Gloria, would a Chris Christie endorsement of Nikki Haley be in New Hampshire?
It would help, I think. Yeah, sure, because, those who supported him said that she was the second choice, and I think, sure, I think it would help. I'm not so sure we're going to see it, but I think it would help her. I don't think he'll be out there deriding her, but he certainly did that in his speech tonight.
And he seems to also be hinting that maybe Nikki Haley is sort of hedging her bets and eyeing, being number 2 on Donald Trump's ticket, being his vice president. And so that's, I think, one of the things that he sees and maybe leaves him not necessarily wanting to throw any sort of support behind her in advance of New Hampshire.
And we'll see if there's a direct face-to-face meeting between the two of them before New Hampshire, and potentially that could be very significant if, in fact, that happens. Do you expect him to endorse her?
Look, whether or not he does right away, I think remains to be seen. The question is, I think he's done a tremendous job. I applaud the fact he took it right to Trump. The reality is he's got very high unfavorable numbers. And so the fact is, if he does, will that help? I think voters are smart. His voters are going to say, let me make my own decision where I want to turn my support. And if you look at where they stand on the issues, they are more naturally aligned with Nikki Haley. So I think that bodes well for her. And in our recent polls, we had Haley within single digits of Donald Trump. Chris Christie had 12 percentage points. If his people all went behind Nikki Haley, she leapfrogs Trump in New Hampshire. The question is how that impacts her in Iowa remains to be seen, but that would certainly give her momentum as she heads into South Carolina and Nevada, and certainly into
She would really challenge Trump in New Hampshire if she got all of those Chris Christie supporters.
The one thing they do have in common is foreign policy, I
Right.
think.
Right.
And so, they're very pro-Ukraine. They're, you heard him talk about it tonight, pro-Israel. And so that's one area where they can sort of find some way to get together, because she is very strong in the way that he likes. That may be one thing he can point to that he likes about her.
Yeah, I mean, they're from the sort of establishment wing of the Republican Party. She is trying to kind of, I think, soften her language on abortion too, to contrast herself with Ron DeSantis in particular. So we'll see. I mean, ultimately, I think endorsements are sort of overrated in this political environment. It wouldn't hurt her to get that endorsement, but I think, to Alice's point, voters are going to make up their mind as to who they think would serve them best.
Nia, as we've been noting just ahead of his announcement, Christie appeared to be heard on a hot mic talking about Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. I want to play this little clip.
And she's going to get smoked. And you and I both know it. She's not up to this. DeSantis called me, petrified that I would.
He's probably getting out after Iowa.
Well,
What did you think?
I don't know what the context of this is. Does he mean smoked in Iowa?
She's
Does he
gonna
mean
get
smoked, overall? Listen, he's looking at the same polls we're looking at, which is that Donald Trump has the heart and soul of the Republican Party. He's at 50, 60% in some of these polls. So it's hard to really look at this race and point to a single state that Nikki Haley, that Ron DeSantis can win outright and sort of catapult themselves to an outright victory. I mean, listen, a lot of these candidates came in with, sort of wishing that they had the kind of base that Donald Trump has, that they could maybe tear away from his base, that Trump, was experiencing sort of fatigue from his voters. Turns out that's not true. It turns out they love Donald Trump in some ways more in 2024 than they did in 2016 and 2020.
And you also have to think about, in that speech tonight, he really got somewhat choked up at one point in the speech when he talked about, I'm putting my ambitions aside. I've looked at this. I do not see a viable pathway forward. And he felt as though he let his donors down and his supporters down. And I think ultimately Chris Christie is going to listen to what do his donors and his supporters want him to do moving forward, and what is his best way to contribute to not just the Republican Party to 2024, but his end game of preventing Donald Trump from getting
Yeah.
the White
The
House.
Biden campaign should be making a play for Chris Christie supporters?
I think not in this moment, but I think not right this second. But I do think as we move into the general election, and if and when, presuming Trump becomes the nominee, then it is absolutely for the Biden campaign. It's going to be all hands on deck because, what are they trying to do? They're trying to rebuild the 2020 coalition that put Biden in the White House. So it's voters of color, it's moderate suburban voters, which presumably Chris Christie and the kind of never Trump wing of the Republican Party, a voice from that wing of the party, can be helpful. Having a Republican endorsement shows, Joe Biden is somebody who is, who can speak to the middle, who can find compromise, which is, I think, sometimes an underappreciated message, something that voters appreciate that doesn't always sort of get picked up in the same way. So having a Republican like Chris Christie come out and say, the stakes are so high that I believe Joe Biden should be reelected president rather than giving Donald Trump another shot at the Oval Office, that would be valuable. So I would say not right this second, but once we get into the general election, absolutely.
But eventually.
Absolutely.
On that open mic, did he say that he heard from DeSantis?
He said that DeSantis reached
was
out
polling him.
petrified.
Petrified.
About what? We don't know.
Whatever that
Right,
means.
we don't know. We need more. Yeah.
Because it means that Nikki
was
would get the
petrified that
votes.
Nikki Haley would
Yeah.
get Chris Christie's endorsement.
Book him
Which
on your
hasn't
show
happened yet.
tomorrow.
All right, everybody, thank you very, very much. We're